Lesson 1.7, we're looking at multiplying rational numbers. So we still have potential negative numbers in our problems. The only difference of what we did in the last lesson is that we could have some decimals and some fractions here, some mixed numbers, things like that. So if you look at example 1 on page 46, two hikers descend from the summit of a mountain. What is Petra's change in elevation? So you can see that Ben's change in elevation, it's a negative 1.2 meters. And then Petra's change in elevation, it's 3.5 times as great as Ben's change. So a couple ways we could do this. Technically, we could try and work with a number line like the book's doing on the left side. They're saying for each, time, it's negative 1.2, so 3 times that would be negative 1.2, negative 1.2, negative 1.2. And then the 0.5, that's like half, so half of that would be negative 0.6. And then we can add those together. That's probably not how we're generally going to do these, but you're welcome to try it that way if you'd like to. Here's probably what I would do. It's 3.5 times as much, so 3.5 times negative 1.2. So we're going to multiply. Just like we did in the last lesson, we know a positive times a negative is going to be a negative. Good guy leaves town, that's bad. Okay, so negative answer. And then with multiplying with decimals, we'll be looking at more examples as we go through. Just remember, your decimals don't necessarily have to be lined up. Decimals only have to be lined up when you add or subtract. Multiply it out. This problem you would actually get negative 4.20. The 0 on the end we don't need, and so we can drop it off if we want. So negative 4.2 meters, so Petra basically went down 4.2 meters. For this problem, if you were working this out, just to show you what would happen, the decimals would actually kind of line themselves up on this problem, because we got 2 digits and 2 digits and 1 in the 10th place on both of them. If you did it this way, we've got 2 times 5 is 10, 2 times 3 is 6, plus 1 is 7. I'm not worrying about the decimal points right now. We'll worry about them at the end. Then we need to remember we need a place value 0. If you have any carried numbers, you might want to cross those off. 1 times 5 is 5. 1 times 3 is 3. And then we add. 7 plus 5 is 12. And then now we're going to look at, there's a total of 2 numbers after the decimal, so we need to move 2 places to the left. And like I said, the 0 on the end we don't need to put there. We do need to remember that this is a negative answer. So negative 4 2/10. So the try it, Megan's bank account is charged $9.95 per month for an online newspaper subscription. How could you represent the change in her account balance after 3 months of charges? Okay, so $9.95 a month, 3 months. So if you were doing a number line, since it's 3 months, we could do 3 groups of negative $9.95. Otherwise, probably what we're going to do is just multiply this. So we can multiply for 3 months. We could do 3 times negative 9.95. Again, if we're working this out, we don't have to line up our decimal points. We may want to take note, first of all, we have a positive times negative, which is going to be negative. Okay, so negative answer there. If you want to go ahead and put that with the answer part. And again, the decimals here don't need to be lined up because we're going to decide at the end where they need to go. If we multiply these, 3 times 5 is 15. 3 times 9, 27 plus 1, 28. Good. 3 times 9, 27 plus 2, 29. Okay. And then we look here, And we see we've got a total of 2 numbers after the decimal. So we'll move our decimal 2 places to the left. And so it'd be negative $29.85. The book lists their answer just like this. I didn't really have a good spot to fit it. Sometimes you might see actually the negative sign before the dollar sign. That part's not real critical on where you place that. Like I said, normally I probably see it this way that I circled in red, the bottom way more than the top way there. But as long as you got the negative there with the 29.85, should be in good shape. And we could estimate this. $9.95 is almost $10. $10 a month for 3 months, that'd be $30. And you can see we're real close to $30 or negative $30, so we should be in good shape there. Example 2, we have fractions rather than decimals here. Negative 5/6 and 2/5. We want the product. Product means we're going to multiply. Remember, when you multiply fractions, we do not have to have a common denominator. Only need a common denominator when we are adding or subtracting. So we're going to multiply. One thing to mention here, they put the negative sign next to the fraction bar. I would like to see the negative up with the numerator, because if we're sloppy and we draw a fraction bar and a negative sign right next to it, those might blend together. See how that could happen? So let's put the negative up with the numerator when we go to work this out. If we do that, we're just multiplying straight across. So we've got negative 5 times 2 would be negative 10. 6 times 5 is 30. So here we are with negative 10/30ths. Negative 10/30ths, we can actually reduce that. We can reduce both of those by 10. Basically, we'll knock a 0 off of both of them, which will be negative 1/3. And again, I'd like the negative sign to be up with the numerator when we write that answer, so there's no question about do you have a negative sign there or not. It's definitely there or it's definitely not there. Example 3, we have a combination here. We've got one's a decimal, one's a fraction. Negative 3/10 and negative 11/30. So the question is, what do we do with it? Well, let's imagine if we were not able to use a calculator, we could either change the negative 3/10 to a fraction, or you can take 11 divided by 30 and see what you get as a decimal. I would suspect you would probably want to change the negative 3/10 to a decimal. They changed it to negative 30/100ths for some reason here. I'm not sure why they did that. Don't really need that 0 there. Negative 3/10 as a decimal is negative 3/10 as a fraction. If we look at our signs here, we're multiplying a negative times a negative, which is going to be a positive. And we'll just multiply straight across. So if we multiply 11 times 3 is 33. 10 times 30 is 300. So we've got 33 over 300. Those can actually both be reduced by 3. And so that would be 11 over 100. And remember, this is going to be a positive, so 11/100ths. Probably we would have it written as a fraction at that point, 11/100ths. Preferable, if it works out, preferable to have a fraction answer than a decimal answer. It actually saves you guys some work, because sometimes your decimal answers, it might go 3, 4, 5 places before it either repeats or terminates. With this, we just have to reduce, if anything, and that's it. So if we look at the try it, part A, negative 5 3/10 times negative 2 6/10. So to start, we know negative times negative is going to be a positive. And again, we would work this out by hand, obviously. Not going to think this out in our head. If we get to where we're doing too many of these, well, we're probably going to steer clear of the calculators, just because the calculator is going to tell you if your answer is positive or negative. So we'll just try to be reasonable and not give you like 1,000 problems or something, so you can get it done in a reasonable amount of time doing it by hand. Before we start the second line, remember you need a place value 0. Also, if you have any carried numbers, you might want to cross those off. 2 times 3 is 6. 2 times 5 is 10. And then we can add those together. Since we have a total of 2 numbers after the decimals, we're going to move our decimal 2 places to the left. And so our final answer here, again, make sure whether it was supposed to be positive or negative. That's a big thing people forget. This was a positive 13 78/100ths. And we could think about an estimate here. Just a real quick check if you didn't have a ton of time to like rework all these. You could say, well, it's about -5 times -3, which would be 15. My answer is kind of sort of close to 15, so we're probably in good shape there. We look at part B. We got a slight variation here, is that we have a mixed number. So mixed number, we know before we can multiply, we're going to have to change that to an improper fraction. So to change that over to an improper fraction, 4 times 6 is 24, plus the 1 on top is 25. Denominator always stays the same. You could look for reducing factors here since we're multiplying, and since they're both since we don't have a mixed number on either case. Otherwise, if you don't want to do that, you can go ahead and multiply these out. When we do this, it's a negative divided by positive is going to be a negative. So I need to make sure that I'm figuring on this being a negative answer. And then if we divide this out, 30 would go into 75 2 times. And that'd be 15 left out of 30. 15 is half of 30, so that's going to reduce by 15. And so final answer would be -2.5. You could write your answer as -5/2 because it's just a random problem. It's not like a real life problem, story problem, where I know what this answer is even referring to. But it does have to be reduced. So either -2.5 or -5/2 for your answer. Part C, we have a positive times a negative is going to be negative. And mainly, just looking at the basics here, you guys would have to move your decimal a total of 3 places. And you can check yourself on this. If you work this out, you should get -356 thousandths. Okay? Again, I'll just tell you that, and you can double check it and make sure you get the same thing. Part D, again, we could change the -7/10 to a decimal. -7/10. We have a negative times a negative. Bad guy leaves town, that's good, so my answer is going to be positive. This, you'd be moving your decimal over 2 places after you work it out, and that would end up being 1 75/100ths. You could have changed -2.5 to -2.5, change it to an improper fraction and go from there. You get 1 3/4 if you did it that way. Look at workbook page 13, number 8. 2 reasons I wanted to look at this problem with you guys. We'll see. One option, one thing to consider is that -1 2/3. We've been talking about changing the fraction to a decimal. 2/3 is actually, if you divide that out, it's going to be a repeating decimal. So that's not going to work well for us. So we're actually going to want to change these to both to fractions. So this would be 7 75/100ths. And if you want to, you can reduce that. Some of you may know 75 hundredths is the same as 3/4. That'll give you a little bit smaller numbers to work with. So if we go to work this out, we got to change these to improper fractions. 7 times 4 is 28, plus 3 is 31. So that's 31/4. Now this situation we haven't seen yet. Negative 1 2/3. I'm going to ignore the negative for just a minute. Negative 1 2/3 is opposite of 1 2/3. So 1 2/3 as an improper fraction is 5/3. Negative 1 2/3 as an improper fraction is negative 5/3. What we have to be careful of there is that we don't think of it as negative 1 times 3 plus 2. We're just going to ignore that negative sign altogether. Ignore it altogether. Get it to 5/3 and then say I know it's negative. Okay? Because it's the opposite of 1 2/3. It's got to be exactly the same, only the opposite sign. When we work this out, we've got a positive times negative is going to be a negative. Multiply. And that would be negative 155 over 12. We know it's going to be negative. I'm going to change it to a mixed number, and that comes out as negative 12 and 11/12 if you work that out. So again, two things there. One is that we have to, in this case, change them to fractions instead of decimals. The other thing is making sure we understand how to change a negative mixed number into an improper fraction. Number 11, after a recycling awareness program, the number of tons of recyclables materials taken to the landfill is reduced by 13 7/10 tons per month. Represent the total change after 7 months. So reduced by 13 7/10, that's going to be negative, and we're going for 7 months. Technically, negative 13 7/10, you could change that to a decimal, is okay on this, in this case. And then if you work that out, you'll get to negative 95 9/10. If you did it as mixed numbers, change those to improper fractions, you'd get negative 95 9/10. So this gives you an idea of how to multiply rational numbers.